Hello, in this video I'm going to tell you about the history of the adventure game, where they came from, what happened to them, and what happened along the way. And that'll hopefully give you some background as you write your own text adventure, and you'll appreciate what you're doing a little bit more. Let's talk about what computing looked like in the 1970s, which is when these games were first invented. This is what a computer system would look like. People did not have computers at homes. Computers were things owned by large corporations and universities. And you didn't interact with the computer directly, you interacted with it through a terminal. And if you look at the right here, you'll see that this thing that looks like a computer is actually, it's just a terminal. It's a way of typing text into the computer and displaying the response. But it doesn't do any processing of its own. All it does is just send requests to the computer and print out the response that the computer sends back. And there would be many, many of these terminals hooked up to a single computer. That's what computing looked like in the 1970s. And also notice that there's no graphics. This thing can't draw high-res pixels. There's no color. It's just text only. And in 1973, an interesting guy named Gregory Yob is learning the basic programming language, and he's looking at the games that are out there, and they're all based on grids. And he says, you know what, I don't really like grids. I'm going to design something based on a different shape. And he chooses a dodecahedron because he likes dodecahedrons, because he's got a dodecahedral kite, because the guy's really into flying kites. And he puts a monster in this network of rooms that's shaped like a dodecahedron called the Wumpus. And there's some hazards. There's some pits and some bats. And using process of elimination, you have to figure out where the Wumpus is and kill it. All right, so that's... it's kind of a game like Minesweeper. It's a process of elimination logic game. But this is really the origin of the adventure game, because you're a player, the game is described to you in text, and you move around using text, and you tell the computer what you want to do, and the computer prints out the response. And this puts the idea in people's minds, well, how could we take this and expand it and make the experience bigger and more immersive and have more for the player to do? But all of the adventure games start with this 1973 game, Hunt the Wumpus. Other stuff that happens during the 1970s, we get Dungeons and Dragons, right, which sets off a big moral panic. And oh my gosh, the children are going to become Satanists. That didn't happen at all. But the Dungeons and Dragons game kind of inspired a lot of text adventures, and text adventures were kind of modeled after these games, because when you play them, somebody acts as the game master or the dungeon master, and you tell the dungeon master what you want to try, and the dungeon master tells you whether that worked or not. So, and again, like everything is sort of described to you by the dungeon master, where you are, what it looks like. So that system, or that mechanism for playing a game, it was borrowed heavily on by the text adventure, the adventure game, early adventure games. They were really trying to recreate the Dungeons and Dragons experience in computer form, with the game serving as the dungeon master. The first game that we would call a traditional adventure game is a game just called Adventure, written in 1975 by Will Crowther, and then added to later by Don Woods. So the origin of this is very interesting. So both of these guys were young at the time. This is what they look like now, or in the recent past. Will Crowther was a very interesting guy. He was part of, he was a caver. He was an experienced caver, and was part of these expeditions going on in Kentucky to determine if all of the cave systems there were in fact part of one major, massive cave system. And in fact, they were. So this gentleman, who was exploring the caves and taking detailed notes and making surveys, was also a computer programmer. And he liked Dungeons and Dragons. He played Dungeons and Dragons with people that would later form the company Infocom, which you're going to learn all about. But he was kind of looking for something interesting to do, and he thought, okay, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to write a game that's Dungeons and Dragons-like, but it's going to be, and I'm going to use as the locations the caves that I surveyed. So he took his own maps that he made during the cave surveys and turned them into the locations that were in his adventure game, but then added fantasy and role-playing elements to it to make it really just a game and not just a walking simulator. So, and here's the guy on the left is Dennis Jertz. He's a professor that's gone and researched the game Adventure. This is the actual location where the game Adventure is based on. It's a system of caves called Bedquilt Cave down in Kentucky. So what Crowther did was he took the real locations that he had explored and turned them into an adventure game. And here he is, Will Crowther, working at BBN, which is a company just down the street from MIT, which features big in the text adventure story. And what he was working on at the time was the early internet. He was working on something called an IMP, which was short for Internet Message Processor. Today we would call it a router. So he was designing the hardware for the early internet. So what he did was he wrote his game and he put it on one of the machines. But because they were on this early internet, that game made it around the early internet and made it to all the to other universities and other institutions on that had access to the internet, or the ARPANET as it was called then. So one of the guys who finds this game is Don Woods. Don Woods gets the game and majorly expands it and adds more puzzles and locations and adds a scoring system to it, and then puts it back out on the ARPANET. So the game is started by Will Crowther, but kind of completed by Don Woods, and and there are many versions of it out there. It's really hard to kind of pin down which is the real or which is the canonical version, because there are so many out there. So Don Woods, Will Crowther, those guys in the late 70s create the first thing that we would call an adventure game. And it's just called Adventure. Sometimes it's called Colossal Caves or Colossal Cave Adventure. It goes by a lot of different titles. And here's what it looks like. It just prints out, it's text in, text out. The game describes where you are and what you see. And you can type in commands, open box, open grate, take key, drink water, kill dwarf, right? You can do all of that stuff. You just type it in with 1 or 2 word commands. It's a very simple input system. You can't say complicated things like kill the elf with the sword. It just doesn't understand that. It can only understand either verb or verb noun. But the writing is very good and the puzzles were good. So it was fun. This thing became a hit if you had access to it through one of the large computers, at a university or a big company or one of these, some institution that was on the early ARPANET. Now, in the late 70s, something else happens. We start getting low-cost CPUs. So things that used to be the size of a microwave now become the size of a pencil cap or something like that, something very small, a stick of gum, a pack of gum, there we go. And the cost and the size of computers shrinks dramatically, making home computers possible for the first time. And in 1977, we get what is referred to the 1977 Trinity of computers. These are the first computers you can go to a store and buy. Before that, you had to build your own computer, and there was no software for it once you had it built. So we had the Apple II, the TRS-80 Model 1, and the Commodore PET. So these are the first 3 machines that you can actually just go buy at a store, take home, plug in, and start learning about how to use computers. So people start thinking, well, how do we take this adventure game and get it into these tiny home computers that are now entering the consumer space? And the first guy to do this is Scott Adams. He was living down in Florida at the time, and he played the original adventure game and was very much impressed with it and said, okay, how do I recreate this type of game into the computers that are now entering the marketplace? So he founds a company called Adventure International, which not only he writes games himself, but he also publishes other people's games. And he's really the first guy to get the adventure game to market with a game called Adventureland and Pirate Adventure. And he wrote many titles of his own and published many other people's titles. These were very small games, primitive even by the standards of the later text adventures in the 80s, and very small because they had to fit on cassette tapes, because people in those first computers, they often didn't have a disk drive, and the cassette tape was the only way of getting programs into the computer or saving your games. So the games were not terribly sophisticated, but they are noteworthy for being the first. So Scott Adams, alive and well, living in Wisconsin, and he's actually pops up in retro gaming news fairly frequently. Here's an ad for Adventure International from the 1980s, all the software that he is selling, and you can see that he's soliciting other people's games. He's saying, "Hey, programmers, send me your games, and I will publish them." Right, and that was because when these computers were first available, there was just no software for them. Like, it took a while for hobbyists to get the manuals, read the manuals, understand the manuals, sit down, write their games, debug their games. And this first generation of software that's available from the is not put out by big corporations, big publishing houses. It's hobbyists submitting their work to mail order catalogs or selling it to magazines and having the code printed in the magazine. So Scott Adams is really kind of the dominant guy in this early hobbyist era of kind of, maybe 1977 to 1981. But other people are playing these adventure games too and decide that they're going to try to turn them into commercial products. And then the next company we're going to look at here becomes the dominant force, the 800-pound gorilla of the adventure game industry throughout the 1980s. But here's, just before we get to that, here's a picture of one of my students playing a Scott Adams game. He came in, I didn't make him do this. He said, "Hey, do you have The Count by Scott Adams?" And I said, "Absolutely, I have The Count." And he is now playing that game here on a Radio Shack computer. And what I did was I took this picture and I emailed it to Scott Adams, and he wrote back and said, "Hey, that's great. Thanks for forwarding that." It's just always nice to throw these bottles into the ocean and see if they come back. So Scott Adams, just these games are so old now, they're just happy that people are still playing them and enjoying them. And here's Scott Adams on the left here. This is at a Retro Computer Festival. He is alive and well. And this guy on the right is Lance Miklas, another adventure game author from the late 70s. So there's Scott Adams today. Here is his grandson, Nathan, playing an adventure game that my son and I wrote on a TRS-80 Model 1. So that's pretty cool. And then Scott is actually standing back there in the background, just out of frame. So that's pretty cool, I thought. And then very recently, he was invited to the Strong Museum in Rochester, New York, which is an amazing museum of video game history, for the inauguration of a new display commemorating his work. And I just saw that he's been asked to go to the Smithsonian and do interviews there because of his pioneering work in video games. So Scott Adams, culturally significant for being really the first guy to take the adventure game and bring it to the mass market. Most of the first contact with adventure games that people had were the Scott Adams games. But Scott Adams is not the only person trying to commercialize the adventure game. MIT students get a hold of the game Adventure, play it, like it. MIT is right down the street from where Will Crowther wrote Adventure, and he even played Dungeons and Dragons with Dave Lebling right here. And so they were friends. That the source code for the game made its way to MIT. MIT students played it, and they really liked it, and they started imagining ways to make it better. They created a game called Zork, which was originally written on a mainframe, but eventually some guys get together. They say, we're going to form a company. We're going to call it Infocom, and it's all MIT people at first. And they take this Zork game that the MIT students have made, and they turn it into a commercial product, and it becomes a runaway success. So what does Infocom do that makes their game experience better than the Scott Adams game experience? Well, they've got a couple of extra years of time to build a really good system for making the games. They don't just write games. They build an entire tool chain for writing games using specific languages designed just for writing adventure games. So the three tricks that they come up with, and I'm going to talk about more of these in detail later. They make a virtual machine, right? A virtual machine can run on any platform, and anywhere that virtual machine is, you can run your game. So they develop a portable system for running their games based on a virtual machine. And they also use a virtual memory system so that their games can be bigger. This requires a floppy disk, which most people have by the early 80s. But it means that instead of being 16K, your games can be 120K. So vastly improved the size of the game. The writing was very good. The quality of the games, the craftsmanship was excellent. And they also they could also get a lot of game into a disk by using text compression. They found ways to take the standard text and compress it down so you could get more of it on a disk. So you had games that were portable, games that were larger. and games that were very, very well written. And this allowed Infocom to dominate the text adventure game industry throughout the 1980s. They also had a much, much more sophisticated parser. So when you talked to the game and you typed commands, you could type the commands as though you were speaking them, as opposed to kind of a stilted or artificial language. Like you could, you can't, instead of saying give box, you can say give the box to the troll, give the box to the angry troll, and you'd understood compound sentences too, like you see here. Put the rusty knife in the gold coffin, then go north. Right? That's a real English sentence. A lot more like Siri. You can communicate with the game in a much more natural manner, and that made the experience of playing the games that much more immersive. Like you really felt like you were talking to the computer rather than typing commands to a program. And Infocom published many, many games, some, most of which are now considered classics. Certainly the Zork series, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which was a best-selling book, was turned into a text adventure that was very, very popular. One of my personal favorites is also Planetfall. I love the writing in that game. It's great. So Infocom dominates the adventure game industry throughout the 1980s. However, not all is well. Now, initially, the adventure games are not graphical because the memory is limited, and any space that is used for graphics is taking up space that could have been used to make the game bigger or more immersive or more complicated. So there's really a trade-off between do you want to have graphics in a smaller game, or do you want to have all text and have a much richer game experience? And Infocom said, you know what, we're just going to go all text. Graphics, nope, we're not really going to do that, because graphics in the 80s were relatively primitive. But people like graphics. Most people want to see something on their screen, especially if they've paid for the hardware. And we start getting the rise of games like this, and you can see that it's a text adventure on the bottom, but there's graphics on the top. So we have, we can see the graphics creeping in to the adventure games, even at a very early point here. Here's another picture. This game is called Message from Andromeda. I just thought it was a cute game. I played it on a Sinclair Spectrum computer. But you can see how we've got it's a fusion of graphics and text. And that's kind of the direction that the adventure game was going, even though Infocom couldn't really see it. By the mid to late 80s, we started getting the King's Quest games. Now we've got pretty graphics and a character that's controllable. You can walk this guy around. But notice at the bottom, you still have text. You can still type commands to the game the same way you could to an Infocom game. Now the quality of the text, is not nearly as good as Infocom, but it's an attempt to provide a picture, to make the game more entertaining using graphics, and that's the direction that things were going. Even though Infocom couldn't really see it, we also get the rise of the consoles, right? Atari crashes, and or in 1983 we have the big video game crash of 1983 in North America. But by the mid 80s, the consoles are back. We get the NES, and these offer an amazing gaming experience. I mean, like Pirates, great game. You sail around, the Caribbean, you sword fight, you find buried treasure, and raid towns. I mean, it's an adventure game too. Legend of Zelda, it's very much an adventure game. Metroid, it's really got some adventure game elements to it, right? So that experience of just sitting at a terminal, typing in text, getting text back, it starts to feel a little old and obsolete by the time we get to the mid to late 80s, because so many other, other games are now possible. Because text adventure started with text only because that's all they had. But as the hardware gets better, don't you want your game to take advantage of that? Well, of course you do. So we have the rise of the consoles. Computer games also get better. This is Maniac Mansion from 1977. I don't know. You could say the graphics are crude. You could say they're stylized. I like them. And the interface at the bottom is text driven, but it's much smarter than a text adventure. Or I wouldn't say it's smarter. It guides you more than a text adventure would. So you select the verb, and then it tells you what nouns that verb could apply to. So it can kind of guide you toward the solution, and you don't have to just kind of blindly guess. So here we've got adventures continuing to go graphical, and then so by the late 80s, the text adventure industry is really dead. It has completely collapsed. Graphics are the way to go. And we get, and by the mid 90s, we start getting the CD-ROM drives. And this is the pendulum swinging too far the other way, I would say. Now it's like you've got a CD-ROM that's got lots and lots of graphics and sound that blows away anything from the 1980s, but the gameplay is often terrible. It's just, you just kind of point and click on things and you drag things around, and the puzzles are very, very simple and primitive. And I remember playing through, games in a day or two, wondering like, what the heck? I mean, we used to spend months playing the text adventure games. So I think in the 90s things kind of swung the other way, with these CD-ROM driven games. Although there were some good ones like Myst. Myst is definitely recognized as a classic, and it's very much based on the text adventure kind of style of play, but with graphics. But then we also get in the mid 90s the rise of the first person shooter, because now we've got machines that are running at 60 megahertz instead of 1 megahertz, and we've got graphics cards and Sound Blaster music cards. So when you've got the adrenaline-soaked first-person shooter, the text adventure kind of is just, who wants to play those anymore? And they really just kind of fall off the face of the earth. But interestingly enough, we also get the rise of the internet during the mid-90s. And if you take the internet, which gives you massive multiplayer capabilities, and kind of merge it with the first-person shooter, you can start getting the first MMORPGs. EverQuest being a great example of the MMORPG. It's kind of the ancestor, the immediate ancestor of World of Warcraft or something like that. So which we would acknowledge as being adventure games, right? So adventure games, if you get text adventures, definitely dead and gone, but the adventure game concept is still there. It's alive and well. People just want to go explore. They want to go on quests. They want to solve puzzles and interact with characters, whether they're real characters or NPCs. The desire to go on an adventure, is just baked into the human mind, and it's just here we're just seeing it in a different form. Text adventures, though, have not died away completely. Every year there's an interactive fiction competition to write games as they would have been written, in the 80s using text only. Although anything based on text is fair game to enter, and a lot of the stuff that is entered is very, very clever and very, very good. So it's not just the same tired old games kind of being pranced out, every year. The quality of the stuff that comes out for this competition is very, very good. And people are still making graphic games the way they were in the past. Thimbleweed Park was an attempt to kind of make a new game in the style of Maniac Mansion, and it raised a lot of money there and was very, very well reviewed. So the adventure game is, it's morphed, it's turned into other things, but it's alive and well, for sure. And I think one of the final legacies of the text adventure game is the escape room. This idea where you're in a location and you're given a set of objects and you have to figure out how to use those objects in a particular way that's not obvious to solve a particular puzzle. This is very much based on the text adventure experience. In fact, I talked to a guy who runs an escape room, and I just said, just out of curiosity, did you ever play the old text adventure games like Zork or Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where you had to solve all these puzzles? He said, yes, I loved those games. So this is another way in which that text adventure, using objects to solve puzzles, figuring out what you've got and how to use it in unexpected ways, is alive and well. So text adventure games definitely do not, not commercially viable anymore, but they're still out there if you want to play them, and people are still making them. So so there you go. If this is going to be out on the hard drive, if you need it. If you have any questions about the history of this stuff, I love blathering on about it. There are many, many great resources that I can point you toward. But I hope you've enjoyed this talk, and I hope you keep this stuff in mind as you're working on your own adventure.